Hey guys, we are finally beginning coverage of Survivor Australia versus the World, which have been out for a while now, and there's been a lot of hype and speculation about it. And to be honest, it kind of snuck up on me where even though I was excited to hear about the season and to see all the names that they got for this season, there were simply a lot of other shows happening at the time that I was covering, and it wasn't really that high of a priority for me to where I kind of just slept on it for a little bit. I didn't even make a preseason power ranking for it, which apologies for that. But now that the season is here, I'm finally talking about my thoughts on it. And I think so far it's been a pretty strong season with a couple of pretty interesting rounds to get into. And just seeing the likes of Parvati and Sari being edited in the AU style is pretty funny to see. And just seeing them interact with legends from other versions of Survivor is also pretty fun. But with that out of the way, I'm now getting to my power ranking following week 1, the first 3 episodes of the show, and I'm going to be ranking them as in how likely I think they are to win the game from this point on. And before we get started, I should acknowledge the fact that this season has been spoiled, at least to my knowledge, and there are definitely spoilers out there. I have avoided the spoilers. I've done my best to ensure that I am not spoiling the season, to ensure that these rankings are based on what's actually happening on the TV screen. So I wanted to at least disclose that. But with that out of the way, we have 14 people to talk about, and this was more time. Let's get into the video. So starting off at number 14, we have the first boot of the season, and here we have Rob Bentley from Survivor SA. And the fact that Rob Bentley ends up being the first boot here, despite him being one of the most dominant winners in SA, is pretty crazy to see. Though with that said, I feel like there was a lot of setup to it with him talking early on about how he wanted to restore balance to the world of Survivor, and really just spends a lot of the episode trying to force the non-US people to work together to take out the Americans in a spot to where it was pretty clear that he came off as pretty domineering, and I just feel like there was a lot of setup to a downfall here, with him even getting this confessional talking about how he promises an American will go home first, which to me just made it clear that that wasn't going to go through. And again, seeing Rob being the first boot here is pretty shocking. Though with that said, there was definitely some disadvantages to him, like the fact that he was a winner on this tribe. Also the fact that the world tribe has a majority of women on it. I think those things definitely disfavored Rob. And while I think he definitely made some mistakes along the way, and I feel like the edit was clearly setting up him being the first boot, it is still shocking to see someone like him going from being one of the most dominant winners in SA to being the first boot on a season like this. So take that for what you will. But obviously he is now out of the game to where he's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have the second boot of the season, and here we have David. And Dave is another person who had a pretty big target coming to the season, with him being the only winner on the Australia tribe, to where you would have expected him to be a target early on, though not necessarily the first boot, where I would have expected George to be voted out first over him. So I did find the fact that George survives a tribal over David to be somewhat interesting, even though I feel like David definitely got set up for a fall as well, where he got plenty of setup across episode 2 with him talking about how he was sitting pretty despite him being this big threat. You have him wanting to target George despite them having built this alliance in the power bottoms, and George even not wanting to get rid of David at this first tribal, where he wanted to instead vote out the likes of Janine instead. And plus you had the likes of Sarah talking about wanting to keep him around anyway, and ended up being a tie vote, which was a pretty fun outcome here, though obviously David was pretty doomed to go out on the revote considering that George was a stray vote for Janine there. So at the end of the day, I feel like David's downfall made a lot of sense. I wasn't really expecting him to win the season based off his threat level. Though with that said, I wasn't expecting him to be the first boot per se, and I would have liked to see him at least make it to emerge and interact with Parvati, considering their connection from Deal or No Deal Island, but it just wasn't meant to be. And it was also funny seeing how David said on his way out that he was retiring from Australian Survivor and everyone gave him a standing ovation, only for him to later become the host of Australian Survivor. So we're definitely going to be seeing more Dave next season, but that's for another day. But on the whole, I feel like David was a pretty fun addition to the cast, even though I wasn't too high on his overall chances, and he's now out of the game to where he's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have the final boot from this week, and here we have George. And George is someone who I thought was going to be the first boot from the Australia tribe. I feel like he's someone who simply had no shot in the season, considering his reputation. And yeah, him being an early boot here makes a lot of sense. Mind you, he did survive at least one tribal over David, which is definitely interesting to say the least. Even though I feel like his edit was clearly not setting up a win, with the likes of Shani talking about wanting revenge on George, and with him just being so talked about as a target early on, it just made sense that he wasn't long for the game. And I feel like this latest episode for him just further sank his ship with him like coming off as really domineering, with him trying to get Janine and Luke to vote against each other, just trying to really like dictate what they do here. And by the end, like it makes sense that George gets taken out here, even though it was a closer vote than what it seemed like, to where it ended up being a 3-2-1 vote. But by the end, I feel like George going out here makes a lot of sense. And yeah, again, I like George as a character, but I feel like he's someone who simply had no shot in the season. I would have been shocked to see him making a 2-hour pass where he actually did, and he's now out of the game to where he's here at number 12. And with that, we have 11 people left in again to talk about. And as usual, I'm ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But at number 11, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is Tommy from Survivor Finland. And I feel like Tommy has been probably one of the most under-edited people of the season so far, where the only content he's really gotten up to this point is a confessional in the intro talking about how nobody knows who he is and that people will be surprised by him, and a confessional in episode 3 just talking about the search for the key box. But really, I feel like Tommy's gotten no real development across a lot of these first few episodes, which already is pretty bad. But I feel like on top of that, he's also not in that great of a game spot right now, where right now there's a lot of talk about the women working together on the World Tribe, where Tommy and Tony are the only two men on the tribe, and with Tony being part of the US contingent, it really just leaves Tommy as his clear outlier here, to where I would expect Tommy to be in a lot of danger the next time the World Tribe goes to tribal, which, considering that we know that the next episode is going to be a double tribal, I feel like that'll come sooner rather than later. So I feel like Tommy's in a pretty bad spot there. Not to mention that his decision to vote out Rob at the first tribal is also pretty bad, as again, I feel like Rob would have been a better number for him moving forward, but now like he's kind of just on an island, and I would expect Tommy to be voted out the next time they go to tribal. But even if he does survive, I feel like the fact that he's been so underdeveloped in the edit just leaves me with little confidence that he'll actually go on to win the season from this point on. So I feel like he's doing pretty poorly from a game perspective, but also not really holding out from an edit perspective. So it's for those reasons that he's at the very bottom here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have yet another person from the World Tribe who I've been pretty disappointed by in terms of their edit. But number 10, we do have Cass from Survivor Quebec. Now, I did consider putting Cass a little bit higher here, as she did get a visibility spike in the latest episode. Mind you, it was mostly circumstantial, where a lot of it was due to her finding an idol and talking about how like she's going to keep it secret. But beyond that, I feel like her edit has been kind of underwhelming, where she did get a confessional in the intro talking about how she's going to vote your butt off, and she was also shown in some of the game talks up to the first tribal, which she did end up voting out Rob there, so make it that what you will. And I do think Kaz could potentially go up if she does get more visibility in the future. However, I feel like as of now, I feel like she's gotten one of the least amount of content across these first few episodes, and while she's in an okay game spot right now where she is part of the Women's Alliance, I'm just not feeling great about her from an edit perspective right now, which is why I do have her pretty low here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have yet another person who I'm not feeling that great about to go on to win the game. But number 9, we do have Janine. And Janine is someone who I've also been kind of underwhelmed by in terms of their actual edit, where she only gets one confession on the premiere talking about how she's hard-nosed and she can wheel and deal. Episode 2, she gets no confessionals, and then in episode 3, she does get a bit more to talk about, talking about how like George is a maniac and he's unpredictable, but the bigger threat is the one that swoops in behind, talking about Shawnee. And yet she fails to get out Shawnee and is in a pretty bad spot now in the Australia tribe, where her and Luke are on the bottom, and I would expect her to be in a lot of danger the next time they go to tribal, which again, double tribal next episode. So I'm not feeling that great about Janine, and I feel like with her not getting as much development as compared to other people, despite her being this underdog, I can't really have her any higher than number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have yet another person from the Australia tribe, and someone who I feel like is kind of all over the place, even though they've gotten more content than the last few people we talked about. By number 8, we do have Sarah, and Sarah was actually someone I was pretty high on coming into the season. I feel like she's someone who had a lot of potential to make a deep run in her, and to be fair, I think she's in a good spot now on the Australia tribe. I would expect her to at least be in it for a bit. However, I feel like her edit is all over the place here, where she ends up getting like a pretty set up storyline with her wanting to play differently this time around, with her wanting to play a more loyal based game, and she ends up linking up with Kirby and wanting to stick by her, even telling other people that she is voting with with Kirby because she wants to stick by her word there, which is not the greatest look there. But beyond that, she ends up voting out David here, someone who she was pretty close to, in order to stick by Kirby, which is already a pretty questionable move. But then in the next episode, she ends up backing out of that, where she talks about how she ends up regretting her decision to vote out David there, which seems to undermine a lot of her story arc there, where it seems like her different approach to playing the game is backfiring. Ends up culminating her like telling Kirby she wants to target Shawnee next in order to even the playing field. But he doesn't even get her way by the end of it, to where the plan later shifts, and she even has a confessional talking about how no one listens to her, how she doesn't get her way here. And it very much feels like she's failing at her redemption here, where they made such a big point of emphasizing how she wants to play differently this time around, how this shift in her game is going to lead to a better outcome, and yet it's not. And we're actively seeing how it's like undermining her, and how she's like frustrated with how things are not working out in her favor here. And to me, this is not being set up as a winning story. I don't really feel like the show would want to present someone who's going to be the winner of AU versus the world in this light. So while I think Sarah's in a decent enough game spot where she's still in the good graces of the majority of the Australia tribe, and while she does seem set up to be a major character in the season, I feel like with how messy her storyline is, I would find it very unlikely that she goes on to win the game from this point on. So it's for that reason that she's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we are once again sticking with the Australia tribe. By number 7, we do have Luke. And Luke is someone who is in a worse spot compared to Sarah, where he is on the bottom there. He is clearly an underdog at this current point. And I'm not entirely sure how much we're supposed to be rooting for him per se, where on one hand, I feel like he does get like these confessionals that sets him up as being this underdog, where he does get the talk about being on the bottom, how you have to like have eyes behind your back because you can be stabbed from anywhere. And he does get some development as well in the premiere, talking about how like this game is like the Olympics for lying, cheating, and stealing. And there's a long list of things he hasn't done yet, like winning, which is funny considering I believe he has won BB Australia, but whatever. So I feel like Luke definitely has some development that could lead to him being like this underdog figure. However, I still feel like it's not really that much at the end of the day. And even then, he does talk about how he simply wanted to be in the majority for this round and not be seen with George, only for him to not even vote against George by the end of it, where he ends up voting for Shawnee during episode 3. So I'm not feeling great about Luke's game position. And even edit-wise, while I feel like there's definitely some setup for him, like being like this notable presence on the season, I feel like there's not really that big of a storyline for him to overcome the adversity he's currently facing. So while I think there's definitely some potential there, I feel like number 7 is about as high as I can put him. Now moving on to number 6, and we're going back now to the World Tribe, and it pains me to have this person this low. However, I feel like they've been pretty under-edited considering their current game position. By number 6, we do have Suri Fields, and it sucks to have Suri so low, as I feel like she is currently doing pretty well, where she is seemingly part of the majority. She's working alongside Parvati, and there's definitely set up to this being like the Black Widow Brigade 2.0 with the women having control there. However, I feel like Suri is the most under-edited of the duo, where I feel like Parvati is getting the lion's share of the screen time. And I even find it funny the fact that Suri's being given the AU treatment, just being mostly ignored in the edit. Where while she did have an okay premiere talking about how like her and Parvati go way back and talking about Micronesia, and again, they're set up there, I feel like Parvati gets more of the focus anyway. But then after the premiere, I feel like Suri doesn't really get much, where she doesn't get anything in episode 2, and episode 3, she just gets like pretty situational content of her talking about how they need to get Tony away from camp. So I am disappointed that Suri isn't getting more to do here, and I feel like Parvati's getting the bulk of the credit for the fact that there is this women's alliance, and I feel like Parvati is being more so set up as a power player there, which leaves Suri in this pretty rough spot there. However, I will also say that one pro going for Suri is we did also get set up to Lisa wanting to work with her, where we see Lisa getting so starstruck by Suri and really going out of her way to work with Suri there. And while that hasn't really panned out much beyond the premiere, I mean, that's at least something to point out. And I mean, maybe that could lead to something in the future, but I feel like currently as things stand, I feel like Suri has kind of been a secondary character behind Parvati, which is pretty unfortunate. However, I do feel like it does also lead to her not being the most likely winner in my eyes. So it's because of that she's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I'm actually surprised by how high this person is, considering how big of a target they seem to be coming into it. And while they could still be an early boot, I am actually feeling okay about them right now. But number 5, we do have Tony Velachos. And I think Tony's kind of in this weird spot now, both from a game perspective, but also from a edit perspective, where from a gameplay perspective, he's not in the greatest spot right now, where he's obviously outside the core of the Women's Alliance. However, he's also like the only US person that's not in that group, to where I would assume that the next time they go to Tribal, that they would want to keep Tony around over Tommy, who is not a US person. So I do feel like Tony still has a bit of inroads with the US people, even though he's clearly the third within that. However, from an edit perspective, I'm not entirely sure what to make of him, where on one hand, I feel like he's gotten a somewhat consistent edit, where I feel like across these first few episodes, he's gotten plenty to do in each of them, which is definitely more than what I can say for Suri at this current point. However, I'm not entirely sure if it's necessarily the greatest content in the world, where I think there's definitely some good stuff there. Like, he does get a proper introduction, talking about how the season will be short and fast, like his gameplay style, and how he's here for the title. He also talks about how his strategy on Winners at War was to lay low first, and how he put himself in house arrest, and that he's trying to do the same thing there. And he's also like being set up as the main opposition to the Women's Alliance, where he is talking about how he knows that they're coming together and how he wants to eventually break that up, which, again, I feel like those things are definitely something to point out. But with that said, I'm not entirely sure if we're meant to be rooting for Tony or not, where I feel like there are still plenty of sympathetic figures on the women's side of things, where even though Parvati has been set up as being pretty overconfident, I feel like we're meant to be seeing her as a pretty major character. Even people like Elisa and Akaz seem to have set up the future storylines, so I'm not entirely sure if Tony is meant to be seen as the main character that will eventually get a one-up on this group, or whether he's like the main villain figure that the Women's Alliance takes out at the next opportunity, where even this latest episode, like, we saw him being like seen as like this obstacle to the women getting like the key box, and I feel like that didn't paint in the greatest light. So even though Tony is definitely like getting more development than other people, I'm not entirely sure if we're meant to be rooting for him or not, or if he's being set up for a fall here that the Women's Alliance had to take out. So I feel like to that end, I can't really have Tony too much higher, as I simply don't know if we're meant to be rooting for him or not. But I think it's the fact that he's gotten at least some setup for him to succeed in the future that leaves him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have someone who I'm also not entirely sure what to make of here, but at number 4 we do have Lisa Stanger from Survivor New Zealand. And Lisa is another person who I'm very conflicted on in terms of what we're meant to be thinking of them, where I think on one hand, they had a pretty good premiere where they got a proper introduction talking about how she's the reigning champion of New Zealand because it got cancelled, haha. But beyond that, she also gets a lot said to wanting to work with Suri, which is good in the sense that we were setting up this relationship early on. And I think there's definitely reason to think she'll be a bigger force in the future based off that. However, with that said, I don't like how she didn't really get much to do beyond the premiere, where I feel like she is very quiet in episodes 2 and 3, where her only content in those 2 episodes is her distracting Tony by taking him to the water well and helping him like stick his head in it, which is pretty funny. And while I feel like she's in a decent spot now where she is part of the Women's Alliance and has a connection to Suri, I'm also not sure how we're meant to be thinking of her as a serious contender, where even when she was talking about wanting to work with Suri in the premiere, she came off as very starstruck, like she wanted to work with Suri more so because she was just a big fan of Suri than because like she like was weighing in like the game factors of it, which to be fair, I think she was, and I think realistically she is in a good spot through that connection. But I feel like she definitely came off as a bit dopish as well with the way she was talking, which again, I'm not really sure if I'm reading too much into that, but that was just something I noticed. But either way, I feel like the fact that Lisa at least has his setup from the premiere and had a good premiere all the way around was a major reason why she is this high on the list. However, I feel like it's the fact that she didn't get anything beyond the premiere is what's keeping her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we probably have the biggest character of the season up to this point, which is good in the sense that this is Australian Survivor, but also questionable in that it could lead to a downfall in the future. By number 3, we do have Parvati Shallow, who is actually the highest ranked member of the World Tribe up to this point, which is interesting there, but Parvati has been the main character of the season up to this point, where we have seen so much of her across these first few episodes, with her getting an introduction, talking about how like this is her 5th time playing, how it's so cute that these Australians think that they know how to play the game, You have her setting up the Women's Alliance and the Black Widow Brigade 2.0. You have her talking even about her relationship with David, talking about how like they knew each other from Deal or No Deal Island, which is interesting. Even though David was voted out, I mean, I still find that interesting. You also have her wanting to work with Rob initially, only for Rob to later want to target the Americans, and her getting a lot of credit for shifting the target onto Rob. And just in general, she's been getting the Australian Survivor treatment of her getting so many confessionals of her just saying the same thing over and over again, which again, the fact that we're having Party of all people getting this treatment is really funny. So again, I feel like all those things are a major reason why she is this high on the list, as I feel like she is definitely going to be a big character in the season. However, I think there are also some red flags that make me question whether she'll actually go on to win the game, where for one, I think there are definitely some people who are setting up to undermine her, where you obviously have Tony there, who is being set up as the main opposition to the Women's Alliance. I think that's worth considering. She also gets a bit undercut in episode 3, where she talks about how like she has this alliance that'll move mountains for her, which is immediately followed up by Cass finding her idol and saying that she's not going to tell anyone, which I feel like is meant to undermine Parvati there. And I think beyond that, just the fact that Parvati is on the World Tribe is something that I would assume will make it hard for her to win, which is definitely something that I had thought about in the preseason. The fact that I would assume that the Australians would want to vote for one of their own to win at the end over someone from the World Tribe, as considering that the season is meant to crown the greatest Survivor player ever, I would assume that that would just give the World Tribe an inherent disadvantage, especially on a show like Australian Survivor. So I feel like those things are all major reasons why I'm not comfortable with Parvati being number one. Then also, I feel like she has gotten way more screen time than the top two people, to where I doubt that she'll actually win by the end of it. However, I still think she's a major character on the season, and that's why she's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and as I alluded to a moment ago, these top 2 are both on the Australia tribe, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 2, I did decide to go with Kirby. And I think Kirby is kind of in this interesting spot where I feel like she has been getting plenty of setup to her being this big power player on the Australia tribe, with her talking about how she's the rebel queen in her intro, how she wants every move to be a blindside. And we have seen a lot of Kirby like putting a lot of work to build this alliance. She obviously picks up Sarah early on, who wants to work with her. And she has been shown as being a pretty major force across these first 2 tribals, where she was obviously a major force in targeting David at the first tribal, which is funny considering that David wanted to work with her. And then in episode 3, she's able to vet out George despite Sarah wanting to vet out Shani to weaken Kirby. But Kirby's able to keep Shani in the game alongside Sarah. So again, I feel like Kirby has been in a pretty strong spot from a game perspective. And I feel like for a lot of it, we've also been getting a lot of her perspective, to where I feel like she has been one of the bigger characters on the Australia tribe. In general, I would expect Kirby to be able to continue to do well in the game moving forward. Though with that said, I also have some question marks over Kirby and whether she can actually win or not, where again, I think the Sarah relationship is definitely one that seems to be rocky, where even though Sarah's talked about wanting to be loyal and that's why she sticks by Kirby, we've also seen Sarah being frustrated by this loyalty game and how she wanted to get out Shani, but it's not getting her way, which if you think that Sarah will eventually try to shift course and in doing so undermine Kirby there, so I think that's worth considering. And I think the show has not shied away from showing the bumps in Kirby's road, where even though she got her way in episode 2 by targeting David, you also had that scene where George threw Kirby under the bus to David by telling David that Kirby was one to throw out David's name. So again, I feel like that's not particularly great either. And while I still think Kirby is someone who is in a good spot game-wise, I feel like there's enough holes in her edit up to this point to where I couldn't really have her any higher than number 2. And now at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor Australia versus the world at this current point is Shani. Now, to be fair, I still have reservations about Shani's edit, where I think the biggest one is the fact that she got a lot of focus in week 1 talking about George and how she wants revenge on George. And she ends up doing so. She ends up taking out George in episode 3, which is good in the sense that she fulfills that storyline. But it also makes me wonder what other purpose she has in the story, to where now that this George story is complete, what other purpose does she have within the story of the season? And I thought at first I was going to have her lower because of this, as it made me worry that Shani wasn't going to have a story beyond this. However, I think there's enough beyond the George stuff to where she does talk in the intro about how she still needs to get paid, and she even has a Matt chat talking about how she has a love-hate relationship with the game. I feel like that's at least something that could be focused on the future. She also has his relationship with Kirby that was set up early on. That's at least something there. And again, she has been a consistent presence in these first 3 episodes. Now, mind you, she was also targeted at these tribals, where she was obviously a pretty big target coming into the George tribal, and I would still expect her to be targeted in the future, where there's obviously some hesitation there. However, I think from an edit perspective, I probably have less concerns about Shawnee's edit at this point compared to Kirby or Parvati, where I think for Parvati, she has simply been overexposed in the edit while still having the seeds of a future downfall. And I think for Kirby, I think we've seen some sloppiness with Kirby's game and some hesitation with Sarah's approach to the game. Whereas I feel like Shawnee, I probably have less concerns with Shawnee's edit at this current point, even though it's still not perfect, to where I'm still comfortable with her being number 1. And obviously, we'll have to see what next week brings, but I think considering where things are currently at, I think Shawnee is probably the most likely person to win for me right now. So it's for that reason that she's here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you liked this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so be on the lookout for that. I'm covering Big Brother 27 and doing a lot of coverage of that, so be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.